Welcome to Biology of Marine Mammals. I'm Dr. Leslie Williams, and this is the second part of the topic Mysticetes. In the first part, we learned that an easy way to categorize Mysticetes is based on their feeding modalities. We'll quickly review that scheme to get started. Then we'll explore the two feeding modalities that we have not yet covered, the gulpers and the one benthic feeder. The Mysticetes, or the baleen whales, can be broken up based on their strategy of feeding. So when we look at their feeding modalities, we really have three distinct groups. We have the baleen whales that skim, or the skimmers. We have the baleen whales that gulp, or the gulpers. And then we have a unique feeding modality, which is the benthic feeder. And benthic means bottom. So these are going to be whales that feed in the mud. Today we're going to be looking at the gulpers and the benthic feeder. The gulpers all belong to one family Balenoteridae, and these are more commonly known as rorquals. The strict definition of a rorqual is any whale or Mysticeti that possesses throat pleats or grooves along the throat and belly. So when a whale turns upside down, and you can see its exposed belly as shown here in the top picture, if you see lines or grooves, that's a rorqual, or a member of the family Balenoteridae. Because these rorquals possess these throat pleats, they all do the same feeding strategy, which is to gulp. And as we can see in the bottom picture, these throat pleats allow the throat to expand or distend considerably when they are gulping. So these throat pleats clearly have an advantage for their feeding style, which is gulping, by allowing their throat to distend and deflate again. These guys can actually engulf a large quantity of water, which, as we're going to see in a later lecture, is very energetically favorable to have fewer gulps with large quantities of prey in each gulp. So again, these throat pleats allow their belly and their throat to distend and thus capture a large quantity of water and then deflate again once they have actually processed that water and captured all the organisms out of it. Now, just who are these gulpers? Well, the gulpers, as we mentioned earlier, all belong to the same family, and that includes some very notable species, such as the blue whale, the fin whale, the sea whale, the minke whale. Those four all belong to the same genus. And then we have a little bit different one in the humpback whale. But the humpback whale is still considered a gulper and still a rorqual. The generic body plan of a Balenoteridae is going to be one that is very long and very slender. And with that very long and slender body plan, they actually have a very streamlined head, or a very narrow head. So their head is very, very streamlined, which is evident both in this aerial view of a fin whale and also in the skull photo. So you can see in both cases the head is very narrow and pointy, and of course that's going to have an advantage, as we'll see here in a little bit. Another feature of these gulpers is going to be the fact that they have much shorter baleen than we saw in the skimmers. So in this picture on the far right, you can see, as the arrow is pointing to, the baleen layers hanging from this open minke whale, and it's considerably shorter than what we saw in the skimmers. Of course, each of these body plan features has a purpose. So let's talk about what the purposes are. To have a long and slender body with a streamlined head means that you're going to have less drag in the water. And this is important if you need to be a fast swimmer. So if you're trying to get somewhere quickly in the water, which has a lot of resistance, it's important to reduce your drag. So these are going to be features that help them swim quickly. The shorter baleen is actually a consequence of having a more slender jaw. Because they have a more streamlined and slender jaw, unfortunately they don't have the room for really long baleen, so they have a shorter baleen set as a consequence of that. And as we talked about earlier, having ventral grooves is very important for allowing the throat and the belly to distend to accommodate a large quantity of water in a single gulp. And this picture of the blue whale that's on its side, having just gulped a large quantity of water, demonstrates the necessity of these throat pleats beautifully. So you can clearly see that over here, this distension of the throat and belly allows for a huge accommodation of water and hopefully a huge quantity of prey with it. So make no mistake about it, these rorquals are predators. They do not laze around at the top of the water looking for a little bit of food here and a little bit of food there, kind of like the skimmers do. They chase large pockets of prey and then try to swallow them all up in one giant gulp. So now that we've covered the basic features of the rorquals, let's take a look at some of the species. And we'll start with probably the most famous, which is the blue whale. The blue whale is known to be the largest animal on the planet. And in fact, it has the largest blue whale ever captured, measured somewhere between 104 and 107 feet, which is amazing. Unfortunately, the current worldwide population of the blue whales is not doing very well. In 2011, we estimate that about 10,000 or fewer blue whales still exist in our ocean. Considering that we took between 345,000 and 380,000 in commercial whaling just in the first half of the 20th century, that is a substantial reduction from what we used to have. So the blue whales are estimated to be somewhere around 5% of their previous population size. A slightly smaller version of the blue whale can be found in the fin whale. The fin whales resemble their blue whales very, very closely, just they're a little bit smaller. They're a cosmopolitan species and they are found worldwide. And these guys have a healthier population size of over 70,000, including some 3,000 plus that can be found off the west coast of the United States. So on any given whale watching expedition, it's possible to see a fin whale. The smallest version of this body plan is exhibited in the minke whale. The minke whales are considered to be the smallest rorquals with an average size of around 23 to 24 feet. Now we say that's small for a whale, but when you're up close and personal to a minke whale, that's still a sizable whale. You're still very impressed by even the minke whale size. These are probably the healthiest of all of the whale species, or at least the baleen whale species. They're a cosmopolitan species, in other words, they're found worldwide, and their numbers are probably in the multiple hundreds of thousands. As of 2011, current population estimates are unknown, but it's probably somewhere between 300 and 500,000 worldwide. Now, to move on to a slightly different rorqual species, we have the humpback whale. And we know that the humpback whale is in the same family, but not the same genus as the other rorquals. The humpback whale, as you can see from this picture, actually looks a little bit different. In fact, one of its defining characteristics are its long fins or flippers that are not only very, very long for the body size, but also very white. So in fact, the genus name comes from its remarkable size of its fins or flippers. Now the humpback whales are very interesting and a whale watching favorite. They have some interesting behaviors that are all their own, including the fact that they are gregarious, which means that they tend to travel and feed in groups, which is unusual for Mysticeti. Mysticeti tend to be solitary unless you have a mother-calf pair. They also have very, very long and complex mating songs that the males sing to the females. It's beautiful. And then, of course, they have a spectacular tendency to breach, which makes them a whale-watching favorite. Anybody that's lucky enough to see a humpback knows of their spectacular aerial displays where they come full out of the water and make an enormous splash coming back into the water. It's unknown really why breaching occurs, but of all of the Mysticetes, humpback whales tend to be the most spectacular. Now that we've covered the rorquals or the gulpers, let's move to the last feeding modality, which is the benthic feeder. Now, of the benthic feeding types, there's really only one whale that does that, and that's the gray whale. So the gray whale belongs to its own family, and it's the only extant species. In other words, it's the only living species still here today that belongs to that family. It's also the only one that does benthic feeding. Now this is rather interesting because classically gray whales are defined as benthic feeders, but that belies the fact that they're really opportunists. Because they do benthic feeding, that makes them unique, but what also makes them unique is the fact that they're willing to do other types of feeding too. In fact, gray whales have been known to skim. They've been known to gulp. They've even been known to go into the kelp beds. So gray whales are unique in a lot of different ways regarding their feeding modality. But let's go ahead and start with what benthic feeding really means. Benthic, as I said earlier, means bottom. So a bottom feeder is going to be a whale that goes down to the bottom and picks up mud. So these are mud muckers or mud feeders. They suction up a large quantity of mud. And what's in that mud but small animals, including worms and small shrimp-like animals called amphipods. So they suck up all of this mud with these animals in there, and then they basically push the mud out through their baleen, trying to capture any of the organisms that are still from the mud in their mouths on the baleen plates, and then swallow the animals. So they're mud muckers. It's a very messy feeding technique that disturbs a lot of the bottom. And so from an aerial view, you can find a gray whale feeding by the trail of mud plumes that's left in the water column, shown here. So in this picture right here, you can clearly see the track marks of a feeding gray whale. Okay, the gray whales, as I said before, are also opportunists. So one of the things that they'll do is they'll go into kelp beds and feed. It's not exactly sure what they're looking for in the kelp beds, whether they're eating the actual kelp or the animals on the kelp, but it's not that uncommon to find a gray whale in the kelp bed as shown here. So clearly, gray whales will do lots of different feeding techniques when they need to. Now, gray whales are not a cosmopolitan species. We have only 2 populations left, although they were probably found in many other waters before whaling started. And the current populations that are left are going to be along the west coast of the United States, where a very healthy population size exceeding 20,000 has recovered nicely. But then a not so healthy population still exists in the western part of the Pacific Ocean, off of Japan and Russia in that area, and that population size is estimated to be less than 200, which makes that population critically endangered. A final note is to look at the jaw size and correlate that with feeding modality. So I have here just sketches of skimmers, the benthic feeder, the gray whale, and the gulpers. And one of the things that you might notice as you look at the jaw bulk, as you move from skimming down to gulping, is how in each case the jaw becomes more and more streamlined. So for the skimmers, we have a really bulky jaw here. And then we move down to the gray whale, which has a less bulky jaw. And in fact, you might notice that the upper jaw and the lower jaw are about equally sized, which is unusual. Usually the lower jaw is a little larger than the upper jaw. And then you get down to the gulper, which compared to its body size has a very streamlined jaw. So you can kind of see a correlation between feeding type and jaw size. Now, if you say, well, the benthic feeder is really its own feeding type, remember that the gray whale is an opportunist that does some skimming and some gulping on the side. With that, I'll see you next time. Thank you.